Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Barossa Improved Grazing Group's webinar on interpreting weather station data to assist farm decision making. Trust you're well. So tonight's webinar will be presented by Peter Toomey from Tote Proprietary Limited. My name is Brett Nixke. I'm a technical facilitator with the Barossa Improved Grazing Group. So before we get started into the webinar, just a bit of background about the Barossa Improved Grazing Group. As you can see on the slide, we're a regional group and we're actually based just north of Adelaide, and we conduct and communicate the results of grazing and livestock type projects for the benefit of our local producers. Currently, our key projects is on the management of ewes and containment areas, which is funded by MLA. And also soil moisture monitoring in dryland grazing systems project, where we actually have 4 weather stations, including soil moisture probes, set up in representative soil types across the Barossa region. These weather stations were actually installed back in 2013, and it's on the back of this project this webinar is being presented. So on to tonight's webinar. Firstly, just want to thank and acknowledge the Adelaide Mount Lofty Ranges NRM board for funding BIGG soil moisture monitoring project, and therefore this webinar, and that's that funding is through the NRM levy. Just a bit of housekeeping regarding asking questions. At the bottom of your screen, you will see a Q&A icon, which you can click on and write questions during the webinar while you think of them, instead of waiting to the end, and most likely we'll address these at the end of the webinar. But before we start, I'll just go ahead and conduct a short poll just to sort of get a bit of a feel of who's on our call tonight. So I'll just go ahead and launch that. There'll be 3 questions: where you're located, what is your predominant production system, and what is your predominant grazing system. I'll just launch the poll now. So if everyone could just answer each of those 3 questions, please. And then I'll share the results. A little bit longer. Excellent. Okay, I'll just end the poll there and share the results. So as you can see, most are local. There's 3, some from interstate. Predominant production system is sheep, and our predominant grazing system is a mix of annuals and perennials. So I'll now hand over to Peter to present the webinar. Peter, I've just stop sharing my screen. Can you share yours, please?
Sure can.
Thank you. And just by way of introduction for Peter, Peter's based in Moonta, which is on the Yorke Peninsula in SA, where he runs his company Tote Proprietary Limited. And so his company specialises in internet telemetry monitoring for agriculture, specifically the application of soil moisture and climate sensors. Peter actually hosts the data for BIGG's weather station, and as well as for other grower groups, and so he's well versed to present this seminar. Thanks, Peter. Please take it away.
All right, thanks, Brett, and welcome everybody to tonight's session. We're just going to go through a few things tonight. We're going to talk about the OnFarm weather stations and the sensors that are on them, look a little bit at the way the data is presented, how we try to manipulate that data to give information which can help inform decision making on the farm. And then we're just going to open up the floor to questions, so that if anyone's got any issues or questions that arrive, we can deal with them. So as Brett said, put your questions in on the chat and we'll address them at the end. So the on-farm weather stations, what have we got? Just about every weather station you'll see will have a temperature and humidity sensor. We mount those sensors in a radiation screen. The job of the screen is to stop the temperature sensor from heating up in the sun or from cooling down in the wind, because we want it to measure the actual ambient temperature, not the effect of sunshine or wind. We have wind speed sensors. The standard height for us is 2 meters. You'll see on Bureau of Met stations, they run 10 meters. but there's a fairly simple equation that allows us to relate the wind speed at 2 meters to the wind speed at 10 meters. We use the traditional style mechanical anemometers or wind speed sensors, mainly because they have excellent performance. The ones that we use are very good in that we can replace the bearings and components if anything fails, whereas a lot of the ultrasonics and electronic sensors, they're a throwaway job because they're too expensive to maintain. The other side of the wind picture is the wind direction, so mounted at the same height. The two sensors share a lot of the mechanical components and internal parts, so it allows us to keep them running for the long term with a minimal inventory holding and at cost-effective repairs. Rainfall, the standard method for rainfall monitoring is the tipping bucket rain gauge. So these have a pair of buckets that sit under the funnel of the gauge. Every time 0.2 millimeters of rain falls, the bucket tips from one side to the other, and we count that as one tip. So when we see 5 tips, we've known we've seen 1 millimeter of rainfall. So the rain gauges are mounted so the mouths are about 600 mil off a ground level, which is the recommendation from the Bureau of Met. We have solar radiation sensors. So the job of a solar radiation sensor is to tell us the level of sunshine. So that's measured in watts per meter. The standard definition is if you get above 80 watts per meter, it's daytime. So peak of summer, we'll hit 1,000 watts, 1,100 watts per square meter. And middle of winter, when it's dark and cloudy, we might be down to 300 watts per square meter of radiation. But the solar radiation level is like an overall determinant of how well your pasture and other plants will grow. So it's a fairly important sensor from that viewpoint. One of the things that we've added to the weather stations more recently are these NDVI sensors. So NDVI is the normalised difference vegetative index. And really what that's doing is giving us a picture of how green the crop is. So it just measures the amount of difference in the way infrared light and red light is reflected from the crops. So we're just using that to say, okay, how green is it? And the good thing about that is it tells us not just how well the crop's going, but also it gives us one of the vital components for the evapotranspiration calculation, which we use. And that relies on a crop coefficient. And we can use these NDVI sensors to get crop coefficients. You'll see different forms of NDVI sensors around. Some people are doing it with remote sensing from satellites. Other people are using green seekers, those wands that you walk around with the crop in the crop. So the in-crop sensing from a sensor that's 3 meters above the ground is a fairly recent innovation, and we're finding new applications for them all the time. The other thing that we have is our soil moisture sensors. So the image in the picture there is a typical, fairly typical now, what you'll find with soil moisture probes. It's a fully sealed probe. A lot of the early soil moisture sensors were re-enterable. You could open them and get to access to change parts or to service them. But that design made them more susceptible to water ingress and failure. So most of the sensors now are fully closed. The internal electronics are potted in resin, so there's minimal chance of water getting inside. And so we see a lot of sensors going 10 plus years without needing any attention at all. And so it's particularly important in things like pasture and broadacre crops because we bury the probe completely below ground level, and so it's nice not to have to touch it. The probes that we're using are 80 centimeters long. The first sensor, so the sensor is made up of the 2 brass rings that you can see, brass plates, and they're the actual measurement elements. So there's 8 sets of those repeated at different depths. So from 15, 25, 35, down to 85 centimeters. And at every depth also we measure soil temperature. So the aim of that sensor is to tell us at each depth in the profile how much moisture there is at a given time. So quite useful information from the viewpoint where your only water input is typically rainfall. Cameras are another thing that can be added to the weather stations. Now, we haven't put cameras on the big stations, but it's something we can add later on. There's probably a question to raise of where the best location for a camera is. And if that's a different spot to where the weather station is, it's easy to put the camera somewhere else. But it'd be nice to, in the future, to be able to put out some cameras so that we can take shots maybe 4 times a day. And then over time, you can scroll through the photos and see what's happening. So you're seeing quite a lot of cameras put in around the place to add information to the picture. So that's the basic sensors that we've got. What do we know then to actually present the information to growers? So on the BIGG Group's website, there's what we just call a web app. It's just a web page. Everybody today wants to ask for an app. So we just call it a web app because it's just some pages that are delivered from a web page. And so when somebody says, where's your web app, you can just say, I'm opening it on my phone, here it is. And they wouldn't know whether it's an app that's been developed by a developer or a web page. So we use that to then present the information from the weather stations to show the current readings and to show summary of the data that's happening. So the opening page of the system has an overview page. We've tried to color code things to make it a bit easier to see. The things in yellow are the graphs for our individual stations. So if we click on the links there, there's links to the 4 weather stations. And then to allow easy comparison between the various stations, we have a set of graphs here that let people look at what's happening from one site to the other. So you can see data for 4 sites all at once. Anytime you see the little hand mobile phone icon, clicking on that icon is just the same as clicking on the link in the graph. For everything that we've got in the system, we've got an appropriate help screen. So if you click on the help list, it'll just bring up a little page that helps you understand what's going on. The information that's presented in blue are external links that might be for other sites, such as the Bureau of Meteorology. There's also a link to what's called the Advantage Pro server, and that's the software that we use to present and prepare all of this information. And the members of the Barossa Improved Grazing Group have a login that they can use to go and look at the data in more depth if they want to. When we have a look at the buff coloured part of the slide, so this is where we can see the views for an individual station. The individual graphs are a little bit bigger and tailored more for a computer screen, whereas the ones that are on the mobile friendly view are adjusted a little bit more for screen sizes, and we can tailor those to customize them to make them better display on the screen for mobile phones, especially when they're held in landscape view. And as I said, there's the help option there on just about all the screen icons. So, for example, we've got the 4 stations here, the Flaxman Valley, Kyneton, Canunga and Macolta. And once you've got to this page, clicking on those links will take you to one of the stations. There's a brief single site photo for each one. So if you click on the site image, it'll take you to a full skies view of that site. And we can always go back to the previous level. When we go to the middle section, the graphs for all sites, and the same with the presentation on the individual sites, you just click on the link and it'll go and open the graph for that item. And we can go back at any time or view the help. So when we get down to the level of an individual station, so this is some information for Flaxman Valley, and just without focusing too much on what's behind it, we've just broken this information up. So there's a few parts in the screen. There's a box at the top that tells you the date and time of the last readings. The rainfall information, a brief summary of the rainfalls presented for them. And then we have the current readings from the key sensors. So the current temperature, the current humidity, the wind speed, the fire danger index and the remaining soil moisture, and a wind rose, which tells us what's happening with the wind. And then we have links to the individual graphs. So for each site, there's a similar page which presents that sort of information. The one thing that is also there on the top of the page is a link to what's called live data. So live data is a function that's produced by that Advantage Pro software that I was mentioning, and it provides some additional functionality to review the data. So if we click on the live data link for a page, for a site, it brings up a set of tabs with summary information for the weather station. So the little icon there with the windsock and the sunshine, that changes according to whether it's daytime or nighttime, whether it's cloudy or clear, whether the wind's blowing or not. And then if we sit in the overview screen, we can see information for all of the sensors for the various time spans. So we can see some tabular information and some graphs and then you can change the time span to look and compare. So importantly, we can see when the date and time of the last readings were, and we can then switch time span and switch sensor values. So this is functionality that's provided for us in the program, in the Advantage Pro program, that we don't have to do any programming for. So it makes it quite easy to prepare summary information. You can then look down and do interseasonal comparisons, so you can see what a given month was doing in a given year and scroll back through the data sets. And as Brett says, the data goes back quite a while now. We've got information to 2011. So we're building quite a good longitudinal history of the conditions at these sites. The first three sites, Kyneton, Canunga and Flaxman Valley, went in 2011. The fourth site, the McCulter site, only went in 2009. So that's got a much shorter history. So what do we do then? Why have we done all of this? What we're trying to do, and from our viewpoint as TOIP, we're about getting the information, preparing the information, presenting it, but trying to work with groups like BIGG to find out what we can do to manipulate the data to make it more useful. The fact that it's 23 degrees Celsius is useful, but is 23 degrees normal or not normal for this time of year? Are there other patterns in the information that we can see? So we're trying to dig and identify this sort of ways of manipulating the data. So with the temperature and relative humidity, we can pull out the average, max and minimum values. That's pretty useful for looking at the range over time. We can look at those for weekly, monthly and annual periods, and we can compare it from one period to another. What was it like this year compared to last year? What was the overall average? What was the pattern over a month? Is December this year hotter or cooler than December last year or December the year before? Just to look at that change over time and how it's rating from one season to another. So we can also do calculations based on the temperature and humidity. One of the most used one is what's called the growing degree days, which a lot of people will probably be familiar with. So they'll set a threshold of say 10 degrees. If the temperature is 11 degrees for 1 hour, that's calculated as 1 degree days. If it goes to 12 degrees for an hour, that's 2. And so you can accumulate those degree days over time. And what a lot of crop research studies have done is map the number of growing degree days you need to have a plant progress from being sown to germinating to going through the various stages of shooting to maturity to flowering and finally getting through to, if it's an annual crop, to necrosis. And so you can compare where you are in one year to another year. For example, in Western Australia this year, a lot of the grape growers are 2 to 3 weeks ahead of what their normal planting periods would be, normal sort of harvesting periods would be, which has created a bit of a challenge for some of the wineries to get the fruit in and processed. What's made that worse is that the red wine grapes have come on very quickly behind the whites, so they haven't had as much of a window to clear. So growing degree days is a useful tool to be able to say, look, we're however many days ahead of normal, so harvest is going to come early, things are going to happen early or things are going to happen late. So quite useful. Rainfall, again, looking about comparison between various periods. Sometimes it's nice to know, yes, we had 10 mil of rain in the last 15 minutes, but often it's more important to know how much did we have for the day, the week or the month. Knowing what decile rain year we are. The Bureau of Met have some wonderful 100-year tables of rainfall data for a lot of areas around the country. And you can go back and say, okay, this year looks very much like 1949 to 1973. And in that year, we had very similar conditions. We had this much rain. We were in a decile 7 year. Maybe it looks like we'll finish with a decile 7 year. Or you can say, well, maybe if it gets down to a decile 6, where are we going to end up? If it drops to a decile 6, how much rain can we expect for the rest of the season? So just some really good what-if analysis and doing it with fairly simple tallies based on the rainfall. The fire danger index is something that has become very important, and not just here in South Australia, but also in the other states. The standard method of calculation is the MacArthur 4 Grassland Fire Danger Index calculation. It uses temperature, humidity and wind to calculate the level of risk that if a fire occurs, it will become uncontrollable. And so the country fire services here in South Australia, the rural fire services and their equivalents in other states, use that to provide warnings to people to say, if the index gets above 35, you have to stop machinery movement. If there's no weather stations in an area that are being used, they'll put a recommendation out based on the Bureau of Met information, and everybody in the district has to stop when that data on the bomb station says so. But people who have their own weather station can run their local calculation based on the conditions in their paddock, and they'll get to know what's happening on the spot. Here's a bit of a graph from December last year when we had some pretty hot conditions come through. The graph shows the fire danger index with the red level here at 35. What you can see in the morning is how quickly that value shot up. And this was actually not too bad a day because it only peaked around 75, but there's some days during the worst of the heat we had where it was well into the low hundreds. And so this is a really good indication of how quickly the fire index can grow above the threshold, and then how long it is before it'll come down and it's safe to harvest again. You can see the days either side of that heat event, they were quite manageable and you could safely harvest all day and all night if you wanted to. Spray conditions is another thing that's quite important. Delta T is the standard measure that's used on chemical labels to indicate when it's safe to apply your chemicals. The delta T is the difference between the temperature which would be felt by a thermometer that's in the air and the temperature felt by a thermometer who has its bulb in a beaker of water with a wick wrapped around the bulb. So the water from that wick will evaporate and cool the wet bulb temperature, the wet bulb thermometer. And so the more dry the air is, the more the evaporative effect. So the cooler the wet bulb thermometer will be, so the higher the delta T will be. So in essence, it was a measure of humidity before humidity sensors were relatively available. But because of its long time use, it's still a very common indicator and still a very useful tool for determining when you can apply farm chemicals. So we can see here in that similar period of time, the green zone here is the safe limits for spraying. And you can see how quickly we moved into a period where there was basically no window for spraying at all during those next 3 days at the Kooyunga site. And it wasn't until 6 days later that conditions got back to the point where you could actually apply chemicals again. So a really good guide, very useful. One of the changes that's been made with chemical management over the years is trying to force people to have records of what the conditions were on site when chemicals were applied. So monitoring the temperature, humidity and the wind conditions and doing the calculation of delta T become part of that generalised record keeping to ensure that you weren't creating any off-site impacts, especially in areas where you're on the peri-urban boundary, where you're sitting in that area where you've got residential areas and hobby farms very close by to farms where the impact from overspray can have quite a negative consequences for the people who are living in houses. Frost conditions is another useful indicator. I mean, there are plenty of crops that need a certain amount of cool in order to set their fruit, but we're also looking at how much damage is likely to be done to our pasture or our crops by the frost. So what we're looking at is saying, okay, when are the conditions likely for a frost to occur, and then we'll tally the amount of hours. So on this graph, for example, we've just got the temperature presented and the dew point, and we're looking at the time when basically when the temperature was low enough in the current humidity for frost to occur. And any area where the little indicator is pink, that means that frost would have been occurring in that time. The little blue at the bottom is the tally of how many hours of frost were experienced in that day. So you can see that it's probably a bit hard to read, but the scale there is 300 minutes. So you can see that 5 hours of time where frosts were likely on that day. And you can start adding them up. You can say 5 hours that day, 5.5 hours, 3 hours. So you can say in the 7-day period how many hours of frost you had, and then use that as a bit of a guide to how much damage you're likely to have experienced based on the stage that the crop's at. As I said earlier on, we've put these normalised vegetative difference index sensors in, the NDVI sensors, and as I alluded to, the NDVI gives us a way to determine the crop coefficient. So the crop coefficient is used in the evapotranspiration models to forecast how much water a crop will use in given conditions. It's related in the model to the water use of a stand of well-watered turf. And so you say, in these conditions, a stand of irrigated turf would use, say, 7 millimetres today. And if we've got an annual pasture growing in the same conditions on the same day, maybe it will use 70% of the water that the turf would. So the crop coefficient is that multiplier of 0.7 that gets us from the water use of the turf to the water use of our pasture. And in the past, it's been very hard to get crop coefficients. Generally, they've been published on a monthly basis for a region, but monthly crop coefficients for, especially for annual crops, are way too coarse. So the use of these NDVI sensors gives us a method of getting this information every day. So this graph just presents the daily NDVI information through the growing season. So here in the middle, we've got the period where the pasture was just browned off. There was basically no green. We can see the onset of the winter rainfalls, the greenness of the pasture picking right up. And then towards the end of the season, with the really heavy water use, the crop's starting to brown off, and then finally we're back to the end again. In some ways you can say, well, that's intuitive. We know what the crop's going to be looking like, but this gives us a measure that we can use to accurately tell the model how the system is running and to back up that intuition. Sheep chill index is another calculation we run, and with the focus of the BIGG group on ewes and lambing, it's something that's quite useful. The sheep chill model is driven by a few sensors, so wind, temperature, humidity, and rain. And what it attempts to do is simulate the heat that's lost by an animal, in particular a sheep. And so if that rate of energy loss goes above what the animal can actually sustain, then they're going to die and you're going to suffer high mortality, especially with lambs. So we can present the sheep chill index in the same way, looking at the colour bands to tell us when mortality is likely to be high. So down in the bottom here, there's very low risk. Coming up to the point here, we've got a high mortality rate, a high mortality risk. So when we get into these conditions, it's time to start looking at moving your ewes to a more protected paddock, or bringing them around to shelter, or going around to help identify what you can do if there's any in trouble. So it's giving information to help back up your intuition. I'm sure plenty of people know when the weather's coming, but often you're faced with the decision of, oh, do I, don't I? This just gives you that little bit of extra reassurance to say, yep, we know it's bad, let's get out there. Going back to the soil moisture sensors, we talked before about having the soil moisture sensors. Oh, sorry, there's a typo there. It should have been 15 centimetres. So we look at the individual soil moisture readings, and the individual readings tell us a lot. But what we also do is we sum those readings. We take all of the individual readings and we combine them, so SM for soil moisture. We add them all together and we come up with the soil moisture sum. So if we look at this from a graphical viewpoint, this graph shows the information from one of the sites. The top sensor here in this stacked presentation always has the 10 or 15 centimetre sensor on the top, so the blue trace. Then we work down the profile, so the 25 is green, the 35 is red, and so on down to the bottom. If you look at the inflections in the data, so this is all driven by rainfall, which is shown on the bottom of the graph down here. And so you can see from the rain events that whenever we have a big rain event, our soil moisture rises and rises and rises. The soil moisture declines generally when there's water use by the pasture. You'll also see some decline due to drainage through the profile, but that's something we'd like to minimise. You can see from here that the moisture takes time to move from the upper levels down to the next levels. So we can see that infiltration of water down into the profile. Eventually, if we get enough rainfall, you can see how much here the 80 centimetre sensor has come up, the 85, the 75. When they stop coming up and when we've got high levels all through, we know our profile is saturated. So if it keeps raining under those conditions, then the water is just going to be lost through the profile. So that means that that rain is pushing nutrients down through the profile and leaching them away from into the groundwater. So it's something we'd really not have to experience, but we don't get the control over it, other than to try to keep our pasture growing healthily so it uses as much of that water as possible. So we're going from a picture here where we had all of the sensors pretty much down to zero, moving over a few months of rain till we had them all up the high level, and being able to identify from these individual traces where the roots are active. So when we see this fall over time, especially the rate changing, so we've got a fairly high steep curve here and a much lower rate further on, we can look at that change and say, okay, the water is being used at 15 centimetres. When it stops changing, it's taken all the moisture it can from 15 centimetres, and it starts using more at 25 and then 35 and 45. So the deeper down the moisture is coming from, the harder the plant is working and the more stress it's in. So we can start inferring a lot about the pasture from what's happening on the stacked presentation. If we take the next step of what happens when we sum the information up. So I said we take the individual readings, we add them together, we put all of those little inflections into a total picture, and we start to see what's happening over the season. So this is looking at quite a long time span, several months. And we can see that after the big rain events, our profile peaks. We can see heavy water use through here, rain events topping it up, being used, more rain events, water use taking the water down into April, and then later on as the winter comes we can see we're topping up the profile, and we've got to a position here where at the end of the season we're starting off with more moisture than we had at the beginning. We don't worry too much about the individual values, it's more a focus of the inflections in the data and the change. If we go back to the previous slide, and we can know when we identified the times when the profile was empty and later on when it was full. If we project that forward, we can start to say, well, at this point here, above the 4 in the 40, the profile was empty. Over on the other side, next to the word water in the 74.9, that was when our profile was full. So from the graph, that says that was around 75 millimeters, 75 to 80 millimeters. The bottom end here was when the graph told it was about 40. Sorry, that was 120 was the raw value, 140 was the end value. We take our 120 take our 40 away from our 120, and we're left with 80 millimeters of water use. So the period between the area between the blue line and the red line is 80 millimeters of available water. So we're not too worried about what happens here when it says 120 or when it says 40 on the sum. We're focusing on the difference of those. The difference between the top and bottom is the total water that can be held by the profile. And then at any point in time, we've got something in between those ranges. We can manipulate that a little bit further and say, okay, if we had 80 millimeters of total holding capacity in our profile, and we've currently got 20 millimeters in there, then we've got 25% of our water available. So as a quick guide, you can say, okay, we started off with 100% capacity. We're now down at the point where 20% capacity. We don't think there's much prospect of any rain. So you can look forward and say, yep, pasture growth is going to be minimal at that point with less rain. And so you can start making decisions on stocking and on moving animals in and out of paddocks to make sure you don't overgraze and you give the pasture a chance to recover. So this is just a simple, quick number of this many % of the total left in the profile. So we can also look year on year. So this graph has got 3 years of information from the Flaxman Valley weather station. So the green is the current season, the blue is last year, and the red is 2 years ago. So that's 2019, 20, 18, 19, and 17, 18. So you can see the differences between them. At the beginning of this season, we were pretty much bone dry on water. But if you look at the 2 previous seasons, there was water in the bank at Flaxman Valley. So The pasture during the growing season didn't use all the water that was in the profile. So they've come into the season with plenty of water remaining. Now, if that was a regular pattern, you could say, is there room to put a summer crop in to help take some of that moisture out, to use some of that moisture? Because you may get to a position where you're getting lots of drainage and you're losing water in winter because the profile started with a lot in it. So you can try different strategies to use the remaining water or to keep it in the bank. You can see the differences with the rain events here, that Flaxman Valley started the season worse off than the preceding seasons, but very quickly the rains came in June, much earlier than they did in the 2 preceding years, and caught up. But the rains didn't keep going. The rainfall was higher in the other 2 seasons later in the season. So if we follow that down to the period where we get to September, October, we start to see that from the point of saturation, we've got all of that really heavy water use as the pasture is growing at its most rapid rate. You can see in the previous year, there was a really big rain event at the end of October, which really helped that year's profile. There was some smaller rainfall events this year that kept things going. But 2 years ago, there was very little in terms of rain to get us through that period. And so a pretty interesting way to look at one season to the other and say, are we ahead or behind with the water that's in the bank? And again, relating that to where we are in a decile rain year, to say we're in a decile 5 rain year or a decile 9 rain year, starting to look at the predictions for what rainfall you're going to get for the next few months. So it starts to become a really useful picture. So from that, again, you can start to make decisions on when you're moving stock in and out. How much moisture is left? What are the prospects of more rain? How's the pasture holding up? Do we move them out early? Put them in for short rotations to give the pasture more time to recover? All of those decisions can be helped with the information that's coming from the sensors. The other part of the soil moisture probes we said is the soil temperature. Now we have soil temperature at each depth, but what we're typically interested in is only the top couple, the 10 or 15 centimetres in particular, because that's the one that determines so much of what's happening. If you're growing annual pastures and you've sown them, then you need to get a certain temperature for germination. If you're using urea-based fertilizers, then you've got to get the soil temperature to above 10 degrees before you can get any mobilization of that nitrogen. So if you're starting to look for the timing for fertilizer application, you've got to watch your window to see, has the soil temperature got above that threshold? Coupled with that, is there enough moisture in the profile for the fertilizer actually to do something? If it's putting it on a bone dry profile, it's probably not going to do much. Can we look at using rainfall events to help push that moisture down without running the risk when it's really wet of running it through the profile? So starting to use the temperature as well with the moisture data to inform the decision making on things like application of fertilizer and the timing of fertilizer. So that's pretty much where we're at with the current state of play, what the sensors are we've got, how we then present the data, and how we can use them for decision making. So I will pass back over now to Brett, and he can give us the next step.
Excellent. Thanks very much, Peter. Just pop it on the last slide. Go down to the end of our presentation. Okay. Yeah, thanks very much, Peter. That was a really great overview of sort of, the type of sensors in a weather station, how the data can be presented. I guess obviously you've used BIGG's data as an example, but also then following on that, how it can be manipulated for decision making. So for those who've got questions, can you please send them in now? Just got one starting to come in now. So Peter, do you have any experience or views on using the Weather Zone website and tools in support of farm decision making?
Sorry, I'm talking and I'm still muted. I've just realised that. All of the sites, Weather Zone, Willy Weather, all of them provide information. The thing that's improving the services that those stations, those sites can offer is bringing in local weather station data. So there are services at the moment that will take information from on the ground weather stations. They will validate it and post-process it to check that everything's okay. And then they will import it into their climate models and use that to provide more granular forecasts. So one of the limitations on a lot of the systems that are out there is that they're solely reliant on Bureau of Met stations, and the Bureau of Met stations can be hundreds of kilometres apart and often a lot of kilometres away from a farm. So by taking the information from stations such as these, bringing it up to the people who are processing weather models and running it through, can help improve the accuracy of the forecasts and things that they provide. So I'm a big fan of Weather Zone and all the other services. Swan Systems run some, plus the Bureau's forecasts. You'll see that most of those now are making evapotranspiration forecasts available. And so for the BIGG group, we can take those evapotranspiration forecasts and apply the crop coefficient information, but we also run the evapotranspiration calculations on the big weather stations. So I think that, yes, the services are really good, but they'll be better as more and more of them take the local on-farm data from weather stations like these.
Thanks, Peter. Just a follow-up one to that. Do you have any views on Weather Underground? Is that I haven't heard of that one. Is that similar to Weather Zone, is it?
Yep, Weather Underground's another one that's out there providing services. I don't know how to pick a winner or a champion. We're also involved with an American company called DTN. They're another one that does this out of the USA. But all of these services start with Bureau of Met data, and then they run an interpolation algorithm so that says, using what they know of the terrain and the topography of the land and the way that the wind and weather patterns move over the land, they will then take your GPS coordinates that you've nominated as your farm location, and they will make an estimate of what they think conditions are at your farm based on what their information tells them. So in every case, if you're only reliant on the bomb stations, then your model won't be as accurate as one that's then taking information from weather stations on the ground. And I think in the next 4 to 5 years, we'll see a big uptake by all of the providers of weather information on-ground information from stations like these. So I couldn't really pick one or the other above any at the moment, but I know that they will all get better every year.
Okay, yep. Thanks, Peter. Just a question regarding plant available water, and after you've gone ahead and put a soil moisture probe in, is there a number of seasons it takes before you can confidently or semi-confidently estimate your plant available water? Obviously, you can't do it overnight or within a few weeks, but do you have a rough rule of thumb?
Okay, yes, we've been through this process many a time. The more information we have, the better. Ideally, what we'd like to start with is a complete soil characterisation that's performed by a soil surveyor who digs a pit, takes soil samples out, characterises each soil, and then identifies from that the plant available water or the holding capacity for the soil at each 10 centimetre slice through the profile, and gives us those final numbers. We can then, if we have that information, we can line up the probe information and give you the plant available water straight off. But doing that's quite expensive. There are ways to get the information in a more pragmatic and practical form. One is to go and have a look at the online soil resources that give you information from thousands of soil pits around the country. And in most areas of Australia, there are characterisations available for soils that will be close to your farm. What we can do then is take that information. Also, we can go on site when we dig the probe, take the samples out as we're augering the hole for the probe and have a look to say, yes, does this soil look like the sample pit? Is it coarser texture, finer texture? Is there more gravel and so on in it? and we can start adjusting those numbers up and down. So we can come up pretty quickly using those numbers that we get from the sample soil pits and from the information from texture in the soil coming out of the ground. We can get to probably an error spread of 10 to 20%. And then as we go through the season, we can then adjust that and fine tune it. But again, it's very hard to do in the first season if you don't have the full pit information. If you do, that's great, but otherwise it'll typically take 1 to 2 seasons. Now, the other thing that gets in the way is we can't guarantee that every season we're going to go from a completely empty profile to a completely full profile. So if we have a really wet season, the profile will never empty. So we'll make a stab at where we think the lower limit is, but we may have to adjust that the next year. So yep, typically 1 to 2 years to get to the point where we've got good data, but we're not afraid to keep fine tuning it because we know that the seasons are going to be different. It can often take a while to get it. But it's just a matter of working with what we have, working with the resources we have, what people can afford to do to try to give you a number. It doesn't have to be perfect. It just has to be fit for purpose. Just sufficient confidence that it's a number that's believable and that you can trust. And we will often adjust the numbers based on what people's intuition and feeling of the soils give them.
Excellent, Peter. Thanks for that. Yeah, still got a couple more questions, so please keep sending them in. Just a local question: do we have the fly strike index? Can't find it on the website. So I know we used to have it, and that was a preliminary model you developed, Peter. But just to comment on that, please.
Yep. The fly strike was prepared to help give people a bit of an idea of the likelihood of severe blowfly outbreaks, and hence give you an indication of when the sheep are likely to face troubles with blowfly strike. We did some work a couple of years ago based on some fairly simple modelling. Like everything, there's a hard way and an easier way. We came up with a model that was reasonably simple, but we didn't ever get a chance to really validate it. And because the conditions can be so hard to come by for things like fly strike, it's a bit hard to predict in advance and say, yes, we're going to ground truth it this year. We're quite happy with making it available. It's still running in the background on the server. We've just taken it off of the web app pages at the moment to make it simpler. So if people are interested, we can activate that at any time, and I'll be quite keen to work with anyone who's got some good information and some anecdotal evidence or experience with fly strike to help tailor it a bit.
Yeah, no, fair enough, Peter. Yeah, correct. I mean, I guess it's just good that, you know, it's another example of how data's been manipulated, or various aspects of raw data into an index. So yeah. Just another one, Peter. Just in terms of you had a couple of slides there about spray conditions. Do you want to make a comment about inversions and whether this information could be utilised on a weather station like BIGG, or can be determined?
Yes, it's very easy to go the next step with these stations to go to inversion monitoring. There's a lot of work being driven now by Graham Tepper, who used to be with the Bureau of Met. Graham has been involved in putting the Mid-North Mesonet and now the Riverland Mesonet networks out. They're very high-end, very high-spec weather stations set up for Bureau of Met quality data. And Graham is running models that were developed during his time in the Bureau of Met that basically build on a body of evidence that is used by the EPA and its equivalent bodies all around the world, which looks at the way plumes of air disperse under various conditions. And so the odor modeling, the plume dispersion models, look at what happens to a pocket of air that rises above the ground. If it's windy, of course, it's going to be blown and dispersed, and you can track where the plume is likely to move. So in odor modeling and regulatory applications, if you've got a piggery or somewhere like a big spray booth for an automotive plant, you want to know where the odor is going and where the noxious chemicals are going from your spray plant. So the behavior of that aerosols in those odor clouds are pretty much exactly the same effects as we're interested in when we're looking at inversion formation. And so we're looking for times when the vertical profile of the air gets reversed. So instead of getting cooler as we get more meters above ground level, we're looking for conditions where the temperature actually increases and that warm air above traps the cold air down below. And so what Graham's systems are doing with the MesoNet, they're using sensors at 1.2 meters, 3 meters and 10 meters. And they're having a look at that thermocline, that change in temperature with height, looking at the wind, and also in their case, they're looking at the vertical component of the wind. So using three-dimensional wind sensors to check not just if the wind is moving east or north, but whether there's a horizontal component to it as well. So the more the horizontal component, the more the air's moving upwards rather than side to side. So it may be very still in some areas, so the air's not moving east to west, but it may be a slow current moving upwards, which is helping disperse things. So the critical part of the inversion layer, the 80 to 90% is in the thermocline, the change in temperature between 2 and 10 meters, and also the wind at 2 and 10 meters. So it would be very easy to fit the big stations with a second set of temperature and humidity sensors at 10 meters. If that proves effective, then that would all we need to do. If the work that's being done with the MesoNet says you get a lot more value if you've got wind speed at 10 meters, then we could certainly put wind speed sensors at 10 meters. But the bulk of the work that's being used in the MesoNet is based on models that have been developed and used worldwide for many years. So there's a really good scientific basis for it, and a lot of the information there is public domain. And groups like BIGG can get access to the models that that underpin that inversion modeling. So it would be quite a good exercise to then go through and look at whether the inversion monitoring can be done on these stations as well. It should all be very possible and quite inexpensive to add.
Excellent. Just a technical one. Is there a formula to deduce evaporation rate from wind strength and solar radiation data from on-farm weather stations?
Yep, that's our standard, what we call the FAO 56 evapotranspiration model. So it's the Penman-Monteith modified Penman-Monteith evapotranspiration model. So that's generally referred to as ETO, or evapotranspiration 0 or O for the reference crop. And that's the one that we're running on the big stations using the solar radiation, the wind speed, the temperature and the humidity. And that's pretty much the standard for crop research around the world. And as I said before, that model uses the water use by a stand of well-watered turf. And because it's easy to grow turf in any country, in any location in the world, people can validate the model and truth it quite easily by growing turf under known conditions. And then you can use that to generate the water use for a specific crop. And the way to get between the two is, as I said before, using the crop coefficients. And in the case of the big stations, we're using the NDVI sensors to determine that crop coefficient on a daily basis. So what we've been able to do in this case is take the generally accepted, probably bad performing model, which uses monthly crop coefficients, and turn it into a much better performing model with daily crop coefficients. So, yep, a long answer to a short question.
Yeah, excellent. I guess that also highlights, Peter, just the importance of having not regular data, but also local data to go ahead and calculate that.
Yes, that's right. And one of the things that we can do is, because solar radiation sensors are relatively expensive, and even though a cloud might pass over one farm 5 minutes before it passes over another farm, the total amount of sunshine received during the day is pretty similar. So we can make a calculation that says, okay, we've got a station here being operated by BIGG that has temperature, humidity, wind speed, and solar radiation. But here we are 5 kilometers away at this farm. Let's not install wind speed and solar radiation sensors on that farm. Let's just add the temperature and humidity sensors, and we'll pick up the solar radiation and wind data from one of the other sites and run that through the model. So we've got the local temperature and humidity information and using the other information from the other site. If it was a particularly windy site, you could say, yep, we're going to put the wind speed in. So sharing that information between sensors on different sites is another way to help reduce the cost of the system.
Yep, yep. And just before we finish up, Peter, just one final one. The soil moisture probe, what's the expected life on those probes, or is there a warranty? And you know, you mentioned before about the big ones, they were about down to 85 centimetres. They can be shorter or longer, I assume, depending on the situation?
Yep, depending on the manufacturer, there's a range of units available. BIGG is using the Enviro probe, which is a probe that has grown out of a company here in Adelaide and is now generating sales all around the world. They are available in 40 centimetre with 4 sensors, 80 centimetres with 8, 120 centimetres with 12, and 160 centimetres with 16. So you can see you can go fairly deep. Other local companies like Centec, they make a similar probe. You can get in lengths from 30 centimetres for 2 metres. The most common for our applications are probably 80 centimetres to 120 centimetres. So 80 centimetres, 100 centimetres, 120 centimetres are the most common. The warranty on the EnviroPro, for example, is 3 years, but I've been working with the guys who developed that probe since 2006, and the current sort of family of probes that's gone through a few minor updates has been on the market since about 2008, and there are a lot of those early probes from 2008 still running fine. So I would expect 10 years to be a good life from the probes. We've seen now a couple of older probes start to fail, but that's in probes that are well over 10 years old. In the early days of soil moisture sensors, when they were built using an accessible tube that the head of the probe had to be off ground, you could spend the price of the sensor again over 3 or 4 years in probe maintenance. So you might have paid $1,500 for the probe, and then in 3 years have spent $1,500 again in maintenance. Whereas you can buy one of the sealed probes for, say, $1,400 and know that you're going to get 10 years out of it. The only way it's likely to get damaged is if the cable gets cut or damaged, or somebody maybe was a bit heavy-handed with the tools when they put it in. We found that on one of the big sites where we had a probe failure, and it turned out to be that when it was originally installed, the tip had been damaged. It must have hit a rock when it was being pushed in the last 10 or 20 mil, and that caused a crack, which over a 7 or 8 year period allowed moisture to get into the probe. So I can really confidently say that in just about every case, you can expect a 10+ year life out of your sealed probes today.
Excellent. Thanks very much, Peter. That we might end it there. We've just hit the hour mark, so it's a good time to finish. Peter, thank you very much for presenting the webinar. Very well done. That was excellent. Also, thanks everyone online for participating, and also your questions in tonight's Barossa Improved Grazing Group seminar. Hopefully it's also been very informative for you. Just a specific acknowledgement of the Adelaide Mount Lofty Ranges NRM board for funding this project. Thanks to them. A recording of the webinar will be sent out to everyone who's online tonight, and also those who've registered. So that'll also go onto the BIGG website. And also, if you want further information about Barossa Improved Grazing Group, please check out our website, www.biggroup.org.au, or visit our Facebook page. That's it for our webinar tonight. There'll also be a short post-webinar survey which will pop up after you leave the webinar, so grateful if you could fill that out. And thanks very much, everyone, and good evening.
Thanks, Brad.
Thank you.